I didn't think twice about leaving the deadbolt unlocked. That is the specific detail that keeps looping in my mind, playing over and over again like a scratched record. It is funny how the brain fixates on the mundane when everything else is falling apart. I keep telling myself that if I could just rewind the clock, if I could just go back to that narrow hallway and turn that one little piece of brass until it clicked, every single thing that followed would have unfolded differently. But I know that is a lie. That is not how life actually works. Calamity never truly hinges on one isolated moment the way you want it to. The way they show it in the movies it builds. It creeps in quietly, brick by brick. Constructed through 1,000 small, invisible decisions and compromises that you don't even notice you are making at the time. It was late afternoon, one of those aggressively slow, heavy late July days where the summer air feels thick and oppressive, even when you are standing inside your own home. The central air conditioning was running constantly, a low, desperate hum vibrating through the floorboards, but it was barely keeping up with the heat radiating through the windows. I remember peeling my silk work blouse off my skin the absolute second I stepped into the sanctuary of my bedroom, already feeling a slick layer of sweat pooling along the curve of my spine. I had just gotten home from my job at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. It was nothing glamorous, just endless spreadsheets, client pacification, and fluorescent lighting that drained the life out of your skin, and all I desperately wanted to do was strip away the corporate armor, change into a worn-out t-shirt, and pour myself a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, large enough to drown out the ringing in my ears. The house was supposed to be completely empty. That is the narrative I had fully accepted. Anyway, Carter had texted me earlier in the afternoon, right around the time I was slogging through my third cup of lukewarm office coffee. It was a brief, sterile message saying he'd be working late at the firm again. It was the third night in a row. I remember sitting at my desk and staring at that glowing blue text bubble for much longer than any normal person should have, reading those few words over and over again like there might be some secret code hidden in the negative space. Working late again, don't wait up. It was so aggressively simple, so casually dismissive. It read exactly like a message you would shoot over to a casual roommate, not the woman you had stood in front of an altar with 3 years ago. We were supposed to be a married couple, the kind of couple who, not that long ago, couldn't keep their hands off each other, who used to get tangled up in the kitchen while trying to cook dinner. Now, we were just two ghosts haunting the same square footage. I tossed my phone onto the unmade bed, kicked my uncomfortable sensible heels into the corner of the room, and started unbuttoning my blouse without even bothering to push the bedroom door shut. That is how deeply normal the isolation felt. That is how profoundly routine my loneliness had become. I existed in a perpetual state of solitude within my own marriage. So the concept of privacy had entirely lost its meaning. Nothing unexpected ever happened in that house anymore. The walls had settled into a predictable, suffocating silence. Until, quite suddenly, they didn't. I had just slipped the damp fabric of my blouse off my shoulders, letting it pool around my wrists when I heard the distinct heavy sound of footsteps echoing in the downstairs hallway. For a split second, my entire body froze. I stopped breathing, convinced that my exhausted brain was simply hallucinating. The house makes noises sometimes. It is an older build, prone to the settling of ancient wood, the shifting of air pressure in the vents, the occasional violent knock of old copper pipes. But my gut knew instantly that this wasn't the house settling. These were the deliberate, steady, rhythmic steps of a man wearing heavy boots, and they were getting closer. They were climbing the stairs. My heart violently jumped into my throat, hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Carter?" I called out instinctively, my voice cracking slightly, even though my rational mind knew perfectly well he wasn't supposed to be within 10 miles of our subdivision. There was no answer, just the heavy rhythmic thud of the footsteps reaching the landing. The steps didn't slow down. I spun around toward the doorway, my hands clutching the loose fabric of my shirt to my chest, just as the door was pushed open the rest of the way. And there he was. Hayes. Carter's younger brother. He stopped dead in his tracks. He stood there in the doorframe for a painfully long second, his hand still hovering in the air, looking as though he had just had the wind completely knocked out of him. It was obvious he hadn't expected to actually see another living soul in the house. It was the posture of a man who had opened a door strictly on muscle memory, and then instantly realized the gravity of the room he had just walked into. His dark eyes widened, just a fraction of an inch, and in that microscopic shift in his expression, I felt a sudden, blindingly overwhelming awareness of my own half-naked body. My shoulders were completely bare, my lace bra strap was slipping lazily down my left arm, and my blouse was hanging uselessly from my fingertips, doing absolutely nothing to cover me. "Oh shit," he stammered quickly, his voice a low rumble. He snapped his head away, turning his gaze sharply toward the hallway wall. But he wasn't quite fast enough. Not before I saw it. I saw the flicker in his eyes. It wasn't just the polite shock of accidentally walking in on your sister-in-law. It wasn't the awkward, frantic embarrassment of a simple family misunderstanding. It was something else entirely. It was a flash of something dark, sudden, and hungry. "I thought you were," he started to explain, his voice a little rougher than usual. He stopped himself, letting out a harsh exhale and rubbing the back of his neck with a calloused hand. "I didn't think anyone was home. Carter's truck isn't in the driveway." "You could have knocked Hayes," I snapped, the words coming out much sharper and more defensive than I actually meant them to. My skin felt like it was burning under his averted gaze. "I know, God, I know, I am sorry." He took a single slow step backward into the hallway, but for some inexplicable reason, he didn't fully leave the doorway. His broad shoulder was still leaning against the frame. "Carter told me I could swing by while you guys were at work. I just needed to grab some of my old camping gear from the garage." Of course he did. A bitter taste flooded the back of my mouth. Carter was always doing this. He was always lending things out, always offering up our home as a storage unit, always making casual plans with his family and his buddies that completely failed to include or inform me. He just constantly assumed I would roll with the punches, that I would be the easygoing, accommodating wife who never caused a scene. "It is fine," I muttered, my voice tight. I yanked my blouse back up over my shoulders, suddenly realizing how badly my hands were shaking. My fingers felt numb and clumsy as I struggled to line up the small pearl buttons. "Just give me a second." Yeah, of course. But he still didn't move. He stayed rooted to the floorboards right outside my room. That was the exact moment the atmosphere in the house fractured. That was the moment something undeniable and terrifying began to take shape. Hayes and I had always gotten along well. In fact, if I was being brutally honest with myself, he was the primary reason I had survived the early years of dating Carter. Hayes was easygoing, relentlessly charming, and armed with a dry, sarcastic wit that immediately disarmed people. He was the kind of guy who could walk into a crowded, tense room and effortlessly manipulate the energy until everyone felt at ease. When Carter and I had first started getting serious, when his family was still viewing me through a lens of quiet suspicion, Hayes was the one who went out of his way to make me feel like I belonged. He would joke with me across the dinner table, forcefully drag me into inside conversations, and tease his older brother in a way that bridged the gap, making me feel like I was a permanent fixture rather than just the temporary girlfriend. But over the last year, something subtle had changed in the air between us. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. I don't know exactly when I started noticing the specific way Hayes looked at me. It wasn't constant, it wasn't blatant or creepy. It was an accumulation of micro-moments. But every now and then, usually when the room was loud and everyone else was distracted, I would catch it. I would turn my head and find his gaze locked onto me, lingering just a fraction of a second longer than was strictly appropriate. I'd noticed the subtle way his tone of voice shifted, dropping an octave, losing its playful edge and becoming intensely grounded whenever it was just the two of us alone on the porch or in the kitchen. I had spent months relentlessly gaslighting myself about it. I brushed it off, chalked it up to paranoia, and firmly told myself that I was just a profoundly lonely woman desperately projecting her own need for affection onto a completely innocent dynamic. But standing there in the middle of my bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs, struggling to button my shirt while he lingered in the doorway, the veil completely dropped. I realized with terrifying clarity that I hadn't been imagining a single thing. "I am decent," I said finally. My voice was a little breathless. I said it more to shatter the suffocating silence than to actually grant him permission to look at me. He turned his head back slowly. His dark eyes met mine, locking on for a split second that felt like a physical electric shock before he forced his gaze to drop toward the floorboards. "Right. Sorry again. Really, it is fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Because now the very oxygen in the room felt heavy, charged, and different. He stepped fully into the bedroom this time, crossing the threshold as if an invisible boundary had already been obliterated. And there was no point in pretending we were still playing by the old rules. "You just got home?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah. How was the agency?" "Same as always, exhausting." It was sheer insanity. We were standing there making polite, casual small talk in the intimate space of my bedroom, mere moments after he had walked in on me half naked. It should have been agonizingly awkward. It should have been so deeply uncomfortable that one of us would have immediately fabricated an excuse to flee the room. But neither of us moved. Instead, we stood there, trapped in this bizarre suspended pocket of time, letting the silence stretch out until the tension was practically vibrating against my skin. "Are you okay, Claire?" he asked suddenly. The directness of the question caught me completely off guard. I blinked, taking a half step back. "What? You just—" He gestured vaguely toward me, his brow furrowing. "You seem exhausted, more than usual. You look like you are carrying the weight of the world." I let out a harsh, involuntary laugh, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. I wanted to build a physical barricade between us. "I am tired, Hayes. It has been a brutal week at the office." "That is not what I meant, and you know it." I looked at him then. I really looked at him. I took in the sharp line of his jaw, the dark stubble, the intense, unwavering focus in his eyes. And something deep inside my chest seized up. It was a feeling equal parts terror and profound relief. Then I could see the internal debate warring across his face, watching him decide whether or not to cross the line of no return. He took a slow breath. "You don't seem happy." The words landed on me with the force of a physical blow. They were so simple, so devastatingly accurate, that they knocked the wind right out of my lungs. "I am fine," I lied quickly, the automatic reflex of a woman who had spent the last 2 years insisting everything was perfect. He didn't look remotely convinced. He took a tiny step closer. "Are you sure about that?" "Yes, Hayes." I forced a tight, brittle smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I am perfectly sure." But even as the lie left my lips, I felt the foundation cracking. I felt this dangerous, desperate flicker of truth rising up from the dark place where I had buried it, because the reality was, I was so far from fine that I couldn't even remember what fine felt like. Carter and I hadn't been fine for a very, very long time. We were a failing business arrangement disguised as a marriage. We just hadn't found the courage to say the words out loud yet. Hayes exhaled slowly, a heavy, deeply frustrated sound. It was the sound of a man who was holding back a hurricane of things he wanted to scream. "Listen to me, if you ever need to talk about anything at all, I am around." "I have plenty of people to talk to," I snapped, interrupting him. The defensiveness in my tone was sharp and pathetic. "Yeah," he said quietly, his eyes softening with a pity that made my stomach twist. "I know." Another heavy silence descended on the room. "I should go grab that gear from the garage," he added, finally taking a definitive step back toward the hallway, physically breaking the magnetic pull that had been holding us in place. "Yeah, you should." He paused in the doorway, He rested his large hand against the painted wood of the doorframe, leaning his weight into it. For a suspended, agonizing second, I was completely certain he was going to say something else. Something real. Something that would violently shatter the fragile, polite facade we were both clinging to and force us to deal with the suffocating tension in the room. But he didn't. He just swallowed hard, gave me a single tight nod, and walked away. I stood paralyzed in the center of my bedroom for a long time after the sound of his boots faded down the stairs. I stared blankly at the empty doorway, my blouse still sloppily half-buttoned, my pulse hammering against my throat so hard I felt slightly dizzy. I closed my eyes and desperately tried to gaslight myself again. I told myself it was absolutely nothing. It was just an awkward misunderstanding. It was just a product of my exhaustion and his bad timing. But deep down, in the quiet, honest part of my soul, I knew that was a lie. Because the tectonic plates of my life had just shifted. And once something fundamental like that shifts beneath your feet, you can never unfeel it. You can play pretend. You can ignore the cracks in the pavement. You can bury your desperation under a mountain of mind-numbing routines, corporate distractions, and late-night texts from your husband telling you not to wait up. But the truth is still there, lurking, waiting to tear the house down. I tried with every ounce of my willpower to forget about it. I marched downstairs, aggressively poured myself the oversized glass of white wine I had been dreaming about all afternoon, practically threw myself onto the living room sofa, and turned on the television, determined to pretend everything in my universe was perfectly normal. Some generic, brightly colored sitcom played in the background, the canned laughter and cheerful dialogue blending into a meaningless wall of white noise. I wasn't absorbing a single frame of it. My mind was stubbornly tethered to the second floor. It kept violently snapping back to that moment, the dark intensity of the way Hayes had looked at me, the deliberate, heavy way he hadn't immediately turned around and fled. And, most damning of all, the way I hadn't screamed at him to get out. That was the part that was currently eating me alive from the inside out. Because I should have, right? Any normal, fiercely loyal wife would have snapped at him. I should have been furious, read him the riot act, and made it crystal clear that lingering in my doorway while I was half naked had permanently crossed a boundary, but I hadn't done any of that. I had stood there, engaging with him, feeling the heat radiate between us, talking to him as if the air wasn't thick with something forbidden. I took a massive gulp of the cold wine, desperate to wash the intrusive thoughts down. It didn't work. A few minutes later, the low, metallic groan of the garage door opening echoed faintly through the walls. He was still here. Of course he was. He had told me he came over specifically to grab his camping gear, and the garage was a detached unit out back. He was probably going to be digging through boxes for a while. I sternly ordered myself not to think about the fact that he was 50 feet away. So naturally, he became the only thing occupying my brain. I despised that feeling, that terrifying magnetic pull. It felt inherently wrong, but in a deeply primal way that I couldn't intellectualize. It felt like my survival instincts were simultaneously trying to warn me about a predator and urging me to walk straight into the fire. I set my wine glass down on the mahogany coffee table with a loud, aggressive clack. I sank back into the plush cushions of the couch and stared blankly at the swirling pattern of the ceiling plaster. When was the last time Carter had looked at me like that? The question invaded my mind out of nowhere. It was sharp, cruel, and profoundly uncomfortable. I genuinely tried to search my memory for the answer, digging through the last 2 years of my marriage. But I came up completely empty. There was nothing. Not recently. Anyway, for months, maybe even years, everything between my husband and me had felt impossibly distant. It was entirely mechanical. We were actors hitting our marks in a play we were both tired of performing. It genuinely felt like we were just going through the endless, exhausting motions of a marriage, rather than actually living inside of one. The routine was set in stone. He would come home late, exhausted and irritable, barely managing to string 3 sentences together before disappearing into a hot shower and collapsing face first into the mattress. Our communication had devolved entirely into domestic logistics. We talked about grocery lists, electricity bills, property taxes, and schedule conflicts. They were necessary conversations, but they were entirely devoid of soul. They were empty things, even on the rare weekends when we were forced to occupy the same room for more than an hour. It felt like there was an invisible soundproof wall erected directly between us. I had no idea when that wall had been built, and I had no idea which one of us had laid the first brick. I just knew I was suffocating behind it. I took another sip of wine. This one was slower, more deliberate. The alcohol was starting to blur the edges of my anxiety. But it was doing absolutely nothing to stop my racing heart. Then, I heard the heavy click of the back door opening. My entire body tensed up before my brain could send the signal to stop it. Footsteps again, moving slowly and deliberately through the kitchen this time. They weren't hesitant or surprised like they had been upstairs. They were the familiar, comfortable steps of a man who knew the layout of the house. He didn't call out to announce himself, and I didn't say a word to let him know I was in the living room. For a terrifying, exhilarating second, I seriously considered just sinking deeper into the couch cushions, staying perfectly quiet, and pretending I hadn't heard him come inside. I could just let him grab whatever tool or item he had forgotten. Let him walk back out the door, and keep the evening perfectly simple, keep my life intact. But something dark and rebellious inside of me was violently rejecting the concept of keeping things simple. I hated that realization the exact moment it bloomed in my chest. I stood up anyway. I rigidly told myself I was just being a polite host. I was just going into the kitchen to make sure he had found everything he needed. I was just being family. That was the flimsy, pathetic mantra I kept repeating on a loop in my head as I walked down the hallway toward the warm glow of the kitchen lights. Hayes was standing leaning casually against the Marble Island counter, a bottle of water in his hand. He didn't look startled when I walked in. He looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that suggested he had been standing there waiting for me to finally show up. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Hey." The atmosphere in the room instantly thickened. That same strange, suffocating tension from the bedroom slipped right back into place, wrapping around us like it had never left. "Did you find what you needed out there?" I asked, intentionally stopping at the threshold of the kitchen. I leaned against the doorframe, refusing to step fully into the room, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of physical distance. "Yeah," he said smoothly, twisting the plastic cap off the water bottle. "Just grabbed the tent and a couple of wrenches Carter said I could borrow." Carter said, "Of course he did." A flash of pure irritation spiked in my chest, and it must have bled into my expression because Hayes caught it immediately. "Are you okay?" he asked again. The playful edge completely gone from his voice. I let out an exhausted, quiet sigh, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Hayes, you literally just asked me that upstairs." "Yeah," he said, taking a slow sip of his water, his eyes never leaving mine. "And you didn't actually answer me, you just lied to my face." I looked away, suddenly finding the pattern of the hardwood floor incredibly fascinating. "I told you I am fine." "You said the words," he corrected gently, stepping away from the counter. "That doesn't magically make them true." The sheer audacity of his persistence hit a raw nerve. The wine and the exhaustion were wearing away my filter. "Why do you even care so much?" I snapped, my voice echoing a little too loudly in the quiet kitchen. He didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He just stared right through me. "Because you are not just some random stranger to me, Claire." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that tasted like ash in my mouth. "Right, I am your older brother's wife. That is exactly the reason why you shouldn't be standing in my kitchen examining me about my mental state." His jaw tightened visibly, a muscle feathered in his cheek, like he was violently suppressing the urge to scream. "I am asking you because I have eyes, Claire. I see exactly what is going on here." My chest seized up. Panic, hot and fast, flared in my veins. "You don't know the first thing about what is going on in my marriage." "I know my brother is never home," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He took a step closer to me. I know you walk around looking like a ghost who hasn't slept a full night in 6 months, and I know for a damn fact that you didn't look the least bit surprised when I told you upstairs that you don't look happy. I opened my mouth to fire back a devastating rebuttal, to put him firmly in his place and defend my husband. But my throat closed up. The words died on my tongue. Because he wasn't wrong. He was surgically precise, and I absolutely loathed the fact that this man, who I only saw on holidays and random Tuesday afternoons, could see my misery so clearly when the man I shared a bed with was completely blind to it. You do not get to come into my house and psychoanalyze my marriage. I said finally. My voice was a trembling whisper now, completely stripped of its previous bravado. I am not analyzing it. He replied softly. I am just the only one paying attention. That is not your place. Maybe it is not, he admitted, his eyes darkening. But someone needs to give a damn. The silence slammed back into the room, heavy and absolute. He set the plastic water bottle down on the counter. He never broke eye contact. Does he even realize how completely checked out he is? Does he even look at you anymore? Stop. I breathed out, the word trembling on my lips. I am serious, Click. I said. Stop, Hayes. He exhaled sharply, running a frustrated hand through his dark hair, leaving it messy and disordered. I am just trying to tell you. No. I cut him off, finally pushing myself away from the safety of the doorframe. Anger, hot and desperate, flared up, an instinctual shield against the terrifying vulnerability he was forcing on me. You don't get to stand there and talk garbage about him. That is your brother. And he stopped dead, his posture shifting abruptly. The anger melted off his face, replaced by a devastating quiet intensity. I am what? I pressed, stepping toward him, my voice rising. Say it. He hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, but it was a second too long, and in that microscopic pause, the dynamic of the room permanently shifted. The safety net vanished. You are not okay, he said finally. His voice had dropped to a rough, gravelly whisper. The combative edge was completely gone, replaced by an intimacy that terrified me. You are drowning, Claire, and you are standing here fiercely defending the water. That is my problem to deal with. I shot back, tears of sheer frustration suddenly prickling the corners of my eyes. Yeah, he said softly, his gaze dropping to my lips for a devastating millisecond before snapping back to my eyes. I guess it is. We were standing dangerously close now. I hadn't even consciously realized I had been walking toward him until I suddenly realized I was standing less than 3 feet away. It was entirely too close. It was close enough that I could see the faint pulse beating at the base of his throat. It was close enough that I could smell the sharp, clean scent of cedarwood soap and the faint metallic tang of the garage on his skin. It was close enough that the radiating heat between our bodies felt thick, magnetic, and completely undeniable. I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to take a massive step backward. My brain was screaming at me to retreat to the safety of the hallway, but my feet felt like they were cast in concrete. I didn't move an inch. Why are you doing this? I whispered, my voice shaking so badly I barely recognized it. Doing what? This. I gestured weakly in the few inches of space separating our chests. Whatever game this is. He stared down at me for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Because pretending that this is nothing isn't going to magically make it go away. My heart physically skipped a beat. The air was suddenly too thin to breathe. You think there is something to make go away? I asked. It was a pathetic, desperate question, especially since every cell in my body already knew the terrifying truth. His eyes were locked onto mine, dark and completely uncompromising. You are honestly going to stand there and tell me you don't? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. It was dangerous. It was the point of no return. I should have looked him dead in the eye and said no. I should have forced a patronizing laugh, told him he had lost his mind, and ordered him to take his camping gear and get out of my house. I should have shut the door on this insanity completely. But instead, I just stood there, frozen silent, trapped in his gravity. And in that context, silence was a screaming confession. Hayes took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until we were inches apart. I had to tilt my head back to keep looking at him. Say, it is nothing. He challenged quietly, his voice a dark rumble in his chest. Say the words, Claire, and I'll walk out that door right now. I swallowed the massive lump in my throat. My mouth was bone dry. It is, but even to my own ears, the lie was impossibly fragile. It lacked any conviction whatsoever. He saw right through it. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then why the hell are you looking at me like that? My breath hitched in my chest. I am not looking at you like anything. You are, he whispered, leaning in just a fraction of an inch, his voice dropping an octave. And we both know it. I felt completely backed into a corner, completely overwhelmed by the sensory overload of his proximity. The walls of the kitchen felt like they were rapidly closing in, shrinking the world down until it was just the two of us. This wasn't supposed to be the script of my life. I was a boring, responsible marketing executive. I was a loyal wife. None of this was supposed to be happening to me. You need to go, I managed to say. But my voice sounded completely hollow. It carried absolutely zero authority. He didn't move a single muscle. He just stared down at me, his expression unreadable. Do you actually want me to go? Yes, that is exactly the word that should have left my lips. It was the only acceptable answer. Yes, I repeated out loud, but it came out as a soft, breathless exhale. It wasn't convincing. It wasn't an order. It sounded suspiciously like a plea for him to stay. He studied my face intensely, his eyes scanning my features as if he were trying to read a complicated map. He was searching for something deeper, some hidden truth that I was too terrified to even admit to myself. Then, very slowly, the tension drained out of his shoulders. He gave a single tight nod. Okay, he said softly. He finally stepped back, breaking the magnetic field between us. The relief was immediate, but it was violently overshadowed by a sudden, terrifying pang of disappointment. He turned to walk toward the back door, but the kitchen aisle was narrow. As he stepped past me, he didn't pull his shoulders in to avoid contact. He let his body brush lightly against mine. It was just the friction of his cotton t-shirt against my arm. It was technically nothing. It was a fleeting, innocent point of contact. But the moment he touched me, a sharp, violent jolt of electricity shot straight through my nervous system. It was entirely involuntary. I sucked in a sharp breath, my eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, and in that blinding instant, the terrifying reality of the situation locked into place. He knew I felt it. I knew he felt it. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close to being over. We had just lit the fuse. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I lay perfectly rigid on my side of the king-sized mattress, staring blindly into the darkness, trapped in an endless, torturous mental loop. My brain kept replaying the entire evening in forensic detail, over and over again, desperately trying to analyze and make logical sense of a situation that defied logic entirely. I analyzed the dark intensity in his eyes. I agonized over the exact tone of his voice when he challenged me. I replayed the paralyzing moment in the doorway when he refused to leave. And worst of all, my mind kept obsessively rewinding to that final, burning brush of his shoulder against mine. It shouldn't have meant a single thing. I am a grown, married woman. People brush past each other in tight spaces every single day without their entire world collapsing. But this had meant everything. The ghost of that touch lingered on my skin like a brand. It made me feel hypersensitive, anxious, and deeply ashamed, like I was physically reacting to an illicit drug I had no business taking. I loathed the feeling, I violently hated how acutely aware I suddenly was of his existence, of the massive, complicated space he now occupied in my reality. He had ceased to be Carter's harmless younger brother. He had mutated into something entirely different, a threat, a temptation, a mirror reflecting everything broken in my life. Somewhere in the chaotic span of 45 minutes, the tectonic plates of my morality had shifted, and I was utterly powerless to reverse it. Carter finally came home a little after midnight. The house was dead quiet when I heard the heavy clunk of the front door opening. I heard the familiar, metallic jingle of his keys being tossed onto the entryway console. I listened to his heavy, exhausted footsteps dragging up the wooden stairs. I stayed completely still in the dark. My eyes squeezed shut, regulating my breathing to mimic deep sleep. But underneath the covers, my heart was thrashing against my ribcage the second I heard his tread in the hallway. The footsteps stopped. He paused in the doorway of our bedroom. I could practically feel the weight of his gaze in the darkness. I could feel the suffocating silence of that moment, where he stood in the frame, probably staring at my motionless silhouette, internally debating whether he cared enough to wake me up and ask how my day was. He didn't. "Hey," he muttered softly into the dark, a half-hearted greeting directed at a woman he assumed was unconscious. I didn't flinch. I kept my breathing slow and rhythmic. God, what a nightmare of a day. He mumbled to himself, sounding completely drained. He didn't wait for a response. A second later, he turned away, and his heavy footsteps disappeared into the master bathroom. That was it. That was the grand sum of my marriage. No gentle kiss on the forehead. No desperate need to connect after 14 hours apart. No basic human curiosity about my existence. Just an exhausted complaint to an empty room, followed by the sound of the bathroom door shutting. Just routine. Just vast, unbridgeable distance. I lay there in the dark, waiting until I heard the hiss of the shower turning on, masking any sound I made. I opened my eyes and stared at the empty space on his side of the bed. And for the very first time in my 3-year marriage, I didn't try to suppress the dark, ugly emotion welling up in my throat. I let myself fully feel it. It was a deep, toxic resentment. It wasn't loud or explosive. It didn't make me want to scream or throw plates against the wall. It was a quiet, suffocating, steady poison. It sat heavy and cold right in the center of my chest, and I realized with horrifying clarity that it had been quietly festering there for much longer than I had ever allowed myself to admit. I rolled over onto my side, violently turning my back toward the bathroom door. I pulled the heavy duvet up over my shoulder, even though the summer heat was still stifling the room. I was desperately craving warmth, craving a reaction, craving any sign of life from the man I had married. But there was absolutely nothing left to reach for. The well was completely dry. The next morning felt incredibly surreal. Walking through the house, everything looked perfectly identical on the surface. The coffee maker in the same spot, the mail piled on the counter, the same mundane reality. But underneath, the foundation had completely cracked. I moved through my morning routine like a heavily medicated zombie. I drank my coffee, took a scalding shower, and armored myself in a sharp professional blazer. But my mind was a million miles away. It kept violently snapping back to the kitchen, back to Hayes. I aggressively lectured myself during the drive to the office. I explicitly told myself that I wouldn't have to see him again for weeks, maybe months. I convinced myself that whatever bizarre, highly charged tension had flared up between us would naturally die of starvation, if I simply starved it of proximity. It was just a weird, isolated glitch in the matrix, a byproduct of exhaustion and marital depression. I clung to that rationalization like a shipwreck survivor, clinging to a piece of driftwood. The driftwood sank at exactly 12:15 p.m. I was sitting at my desk staring blankly at a spreadsheet full of marketing metrics that made absolutely no sense to me when my phone vibrated violently against the faux wood surface. I glanced down, a new message notification lit up the screen. The name was a punch to the gut, Hayes. My stomach instantly plummeted, tying itself into a series of tight, painful knots. My breath hitched. I stared at the glowing rectangle for what felt like an eternity before I finally gathered the nerve to unlock the screen and open the thread. Hey, I feel like yesterday got really weird. I just wanted to reach out and say I am sorry if I crossed a line and made you uncomfortable. It was a perfectly polite, completely rational text message, but somehow the simple, direct nature of it made everything 10 times worse, because by sending it, he was making it tangible. It was no longer a phantom tension I could convince myself I had imagined. He was acknowledging it, he was giving it a name. It wasn't just going to be buried under polite family silence. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking slightly. I typed out a defensive, breezy response, then immediately deleted it. I typed out a stern, boundary-setting paragraph and deleted that too. I had absolutely no idea how to navigate this. Was I uncomfortable? Yes, deeply. But I wasn't uncomfortable in the righteous, indignant way a faithful wife was supposed to be. I was uncomfortable because of how much I had wanted him to stay in that kitchen. That was the terrifying problem. After 3 agonizing minutes of staring at the blinking cursor, I settled on the most cowardly response possible. It is fine. You just caught me off guard. Forget about it. I hit send and immediately tossed the phone face down on my desk, like it was an explosive device. I stared at the plastic backing, agonizing over the tone. Did it sound too casual? Was it too dismissive? Did it sound like I was hiding something? The phone vibrated again almost instantaneously. Yeah, me too. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, sinking back into my ergonomic office chair. Okay, that was it, he apologized. I accepted. The awkwardness was handled. We could both retreat to our respective corners and pretend none of this ever happened. That should have been the definitive end of the conversation. It wasn't 10 seconds later. Another vibration buzzed against the wood. Can I ask you something? My heart kicked into overdrive. The adrenaline spiked so hard my vision practically blurred. I hesitated much longer this time. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to put the phone in a drawer and walk away. Instead, my traitorous fingers typed, "Depends on what it is." A few seconds passed. I watched the little typing bubble appear, disappear and reappear. Then the message dropped. Are you actually okay? There it was again. That relentless, impossible question. The one question I couldn't outrun. I felt a sudden, sharp flare of irritation deeply mixed with something else. Something raw and desperate that I stubbornly refused to analyze. Why do you keep pushing this? I shot back, my thumbs flying across the screen. His reply was instant, because you completely dodged the question yesterday. I sat there in my sterile, brightly lit office, surrounded by the hum of corporate life, staring at that message until the words started to blur together. My chest felt impossibly tight, exactly the way it had the night before in the kitchen. I had the power to shut this down. It would be so incredibly easy. One simple text, "I love my husband, stop texting me," that is all it would take to rebuild the walls and secure the perimeter of my life. But I didn't type that. Instead, I watched, almost completely detached from my own body, as my fingers typed something completely different. I don't know. I hit send. The 3 gray typing dots appeared instantly on his end. Don't know what? I closed my eyes, the corporate fluorescent lights burning red through my eyelids. If I am okay, I admitted. There was a much longer pause this time. The silence stretched out for a full minute, and panic began to claw at my throat. I had definitely said too much. I had handed him a weapon. I had exposed a massive bleeding vulnerability to a man I had absolutely no business being vulnerable with. Then his reply finally came through. Yeah, I figured. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. Figured what? That you've been carrying a massive amount of weight all by yourself, and that you are exhausted from holding it all in. I stared at the glowing screen, my mind racing 100 miles an hour. He saw me. That was the absolute simplest, most devastating way to summarize it. He looked right through the corporate armor, right through the polite smiles at family dinners, and he saw the desperate, lonely woman underneath. He saw me in a way that Carter hadn't bothered to look at me in years, and that singular realization hit me harder and deeper than anything else had so far. Panic suddenly flooded my system. The intimacy of the digital conversation was suffocating me. I really need to get back to this spreadsheet. I typed frantically, desperate to throw up a smokescreen. Work is crazy today. Yeah, he replied. Of course. Let you go. Another agonizing pause. I held my breath. But Claire, if you ever actually want to talk. I meant every word I said yesterday. I am here. I didn't respond to that. I couldn't, because a dark, terrifying part of my soul desperately wanted to say yes, and acknowledging that part of myself scared me more than anything else in the world. The rest of the afternoon was an absolute write-off. I sat at my desk, physically present but mentally completely absent. I couldn't focus on a single email. I couldn't parse a single metric. I couldn't shake this profound, lingering feeling that I had irreversibly crossed a massive, invisible boundary simply by engaging in that text thread. Technically, nothing physical had happened. I hadn't cheated. I hadn't broken any vows. But emotionally, I knew exactly what was happening. Something dangerous had been set into motion. At 6:30 p.m., my phone lit up with a text from Carter. Crisis at the firm, running late again. Don't wait up for dinner. It was the exact same message, the exact same sterile, copy, pasted tone. He sounded like a broken record stuck on a track of perpetual absence. I sat in my car in the office parking lot, staring at his text message for a very long time. The engine wasn't running. The evening heat was building up inside the cabin of my sedan. But I didn't care. I felt completely numb. Then, acting entirely on autopilot, operating outside the bounds of logic or consequence, I closed Carter's message thread. I opened my messages with haze. I typed a sentence. I deleted it. I typed another. I deleted that one too. Finally, I stopped overthinking. I let the raw, desperate exhaustion take the wheel. I might actually take you up on that offer to talk. I hit send before my rational brain could scream at me to stop. The absolute millisecond the message bubbled up as delivered, a massive surge of adrenaline dumped into my bloodstream. My heart started violently pounding against my ribs. There it was, the Rubicon. Crossed. The second I shot that text into the ether, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that there was no going back to the way things were yesterday morning. It wasn't explosive. There were no sirens, no dramatic musical swells, no immediate, devastating consequences. It was just a quiet, irreversible, fundamental shift in the universe. It was exactly like stepping off a marked trail into the dark woods. You don't know exactly where the new path leads, but you know you can never find your way back to the main road. My phone stayed gripped tightly in my sweating palm. The screen glaring brightly in the dimming light of the parking lot. I stared at it, absurdly, hoping that the technology would somehow malfunction, that the text would bounce back, that the universe would intervene and save me from myself. It didn't. 30 seconds later, the phone buzzed in my hand. I am here. That was the entire message, 2 words, no hesitation, no prying questions about what was wrong. No pretending like he didn't know exactly what I was asking for. Just, I am here. I stared at those 2 simple words until they burned themselves into my retinas. I am here. Not. Let me know if you need anything. Not. Are you sure? Just absolute, unwavering availability. He was present. He was paying attention. He was offering me everything that Carter had systematically denied me for the last 24 months. I threw the car into drive before I could talk myself down off the ledge. I didn't call Carter. I didn't leave a voicemail explaining my whereabouts. I didn't tell a single soul on earth where I was going. I just pulled out of the parking lot and drove. The sun was just beginning to set over the city skyline, casting a heavy, bruised, golden purple light across the asphalt. It was the kind of summer twilight that usually feels incredibly calm and nostalgic. But tonight, the vibrant colors just made the entire world feel deeply surreal. It felt like I was completely detached from reality, floating somewhere near the ceiling of the car, watching a stranger steer my vehicle toward disaster. Hayes lived roughly 15 minutes away from my subdivision. He rented a small, unassuming apartment complex just off a busy commercial road. It was nothing glamorous, just beige stucco and numbered doors. But it was well kept. I had been there before, maybe a half-dozen times over the years, usually tagging along with Carter to drop off a birthday gift or help him move a couch. Back then, the apartment had always felt completely harmless. It was just the bachelor pad of my husband's little brother. But tonight, the entire atmosphere of the complex felt incredibly heavy. It felt entirely different before I even put the car in park. I pulled into a visitor spot near the front office. I turned off the ignition, but I didn't immediately unbuckle my seatbelt. I sat there in the stifling silence of the car, my hands gripped so tightly around the leather steering wheel that my knuckles were stark white. "What the hell are you doing, Claire?" The question finally broke through the static in my brain. Loud, sharp, and entirely unavoidable. This wasn't just dropping by for a chat. I knew that, and I knew that Hayes knew that. You don't drive to a man's apartment at twilight, completely unannounced to your husband, just to vent about office politics. I could still put the keys back in the ignition. I could still reverse out of this spot, drive home to my empty house, pour another glass of wine, and go to sleep. The escape hatch was still wide open. My hand moved toward the keys. Then, my phone buzzed in the cucfolder. "I see your car." My stomach violently dropped into my shoes. I felt incredibly exposed, like a deer caught in a sniper's crosshairs. I slowly lifted my head and looked through the windshield. And there he was. Hayes was standing on the small, second-story concrete balcony outside his apartment. He was wearing faded jeans and a plain black t-shirt. One hand was resting casually on the wrought iron railing, holding a beer. He was staring directly down at my sedan, watching me, waiting for me to make the final call. That was it. That was the singular, agonizing moment of truth. The absolute last opportunity to throw the car in reverse, speed away, and keep the ruins of my marriage intact. I didn't take the exit. I grabbed my purse, opened the heavy car door, and stepped out onto the asphalt. The evening air had finally started to cool down, a faint, humid breeze cutting through the suffocating leftover heat of the afternoon. I instinctively crossed my arms tightly over my chest, wrapping my blazer around myself. It wasn't because I was physically cold. It was because I felt profoundly exposed, entirely vulnerable in a way I couldn't articulate. Hayes didn't say a word. He didn't wave. He just watched me in absolute silence until I reached the bottom of the concrete stairwell. Then, he turned and disappeared inside the apartment. By the time I climbed the stairs and reached Unit 204, the front door was already hanging wide open, waiting for me. I stopped at the threshold. "Hey," he said softly from the small kitchen. "Hey." I stepped inside and he gently pushed the door closed behind me. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the small room. It sounded incredibly loud. It sounded shockingly final. The apartment smelled faintly of dark roast coffee and something else. Something clean, like fresh laundry detergent mixed with cedar. It was surprisingly neat. It was organized and deliberately tidy in a way that genuinely surprised me. Hayes had always projected this rugged, careless aura, but the space was meticulously kept. "Do you want something to drink?" he asked, his voice low and incredibly calm. "Water, a beer, wine?" "Water is fine. Please." He gave a small nod and turned toward the refrigerator, while I stayed frozen near the entryway, suddenly paralyzed by the reality of my surroundings. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I didn't know where to look. This wasn't my territory. This wasn't my space. And yet, I had actively chosen to walk into it. The sheer weight of that choice made my lungs feel tight. He walked back over a moment later, handing me a sweating glass of ice water. As I reached out to take it, our fingers brushed. It was just a fraction of a second of skin-on-skin contact. But just like the afternoon before in my kitchen, That microscopic touch sent a violent, sharp wave of awareness rocketing through my nervous system. My breath caught slightly. We both noticed it. We both stared at our hands for a second. Neither of us said a word to acknowledge it. "Do you want to sit down?" he asked, gesturing gently toward the dark gray sectional couch dominating the small living room. "Yeah, thanks." I walked over and sat stiffly on the absolute farthest edge of the cushions. He walked over and sat on the completely opposite end. We were sitting several feet apart. It was entirely too much physical distance to accidentally touch, but the emotional proximity was suffocating. I could feel the heat radiating off of him from across the cushions. For a very long, highly pressurized minute, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the apartment was the faint rhythmic ticking of a wall clock in the kitchen. Then, Hayes leaned forward. He rested his elbows heavily on his knees, clasping his hands together and letting them hang between his legs. He turned his head and looked at me with an expression of such pure undivided attention that it almost hurt to look at him. "So," he said. His voice a low, incredibly gentle rumble. "Talk to me, Claire." It was so simple. There was absolutely no pressure. No leading questions. No immediate demands for an explanation. He was just opening a door and giving me the floor. I stared intensely down at the glass of water trembling in my hands, watching the condensation drip down the sides and pool over my knuckles. I honestly don't even know where to start," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Start anywhere you want, take your time." I let out a slow, shuddering breath, trying to unlock the vault in my chest. "It is just everything feels entirely broken lately." I started, the words tumbling out clumsily. "With Carter, with my career, with my entire life. I don't even know who I am anymore." He didn't interrupt. He didn't immediately jump in to offer toxic positivity or unhelpful advice. He just sat there in absolute stillness and listened to me. And that profound silence made it infinitely easier to keep bleeding the words out. "Carter and I used to be good," I continued, my voice thick with unshed tears. "We used to be really, really good together. We used to laugh until we couldn't breathe. And I honestly have no idea when the rot set in. But somewhere along the way, we just broke. It stopped feeling like a partnership. It stopped feeling like us." I saw Hayes's jaw tighten violently at the mention of his brother's name, the muscles pulsing under his skin, but he kept his mouth firmly shut. "He is never home anymore," I whispered, staring blindly at the coffee table. "And even on the rare occasions when he is physically in the house, it is like his mind is 1,000 miles away. I try to talk to him. I try to reach out and connect, and it just crashes into a brick wall. It is exactly like talking to a ghost. I am so incredibly lonely. Hayes, I am drowning in that house." "That is not how a marriage is supposed to work, Claire," Hayes said softly, the anger barely restrained in his tone. "I know." "And have you actually told him this? Have you laid it out for him?" I hesitated, shame burning hot in my cheeks. Not exactly like this. Why the hell not?" I squeezed my eyes shut because I was terrified of the actual answer, because I didn't want to force a confrontation where he finally looked me in the eye and admitted that he simply didn't care about me anymore. Because for the last 2 years, it had felt significantly safer and infinitely easier to just quietly exist in the miserable silence, rather than risk detonating the bomb that would destroy my entire life. "I don't know," I lied, my voice cracking. Hayes studied my face for a long, heavy moment. It felt like he was looking straight through my skull, reading every cowardly thought I was trying to hide. "You deserve so much better than what he is giving you," he said finally, the absolute certainty in his voice making my chest ache. The words hit me harder than they should have. They were incredibly dangerous. "Don't say that," I replied quickly, my defensive walls snapping back into place. "Why shouldn't I? It is the truth, because you are his brother. You can't say things like that to me, and you are. I stopped stammering, catching myself right on the edge of the cliff, exactly the way he had done the afternoon before in my kitchen. I looked up, meeting his intense, dark gaze. "Say it, Hayes." His eyes locked onto mine, and I could physically feel the unspoken dangerous current building rapidly in the air between us. It was heavy, electric, and inevitable. "And you are someone I care about a hell of a lot." He finished, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. My heart violently skipped a beat. The small living room suddenly felt like it was shrinking, the walls compressing inward until all the oxygen was sucked out. "Hayes," I started, my voice trembling. But my brain completely short-circuited. I had absolutely no idea what I was even trying to articulate. Was I trying to issue a firm warning? Establish a boundary? Or was I desperately begging him to keep talking? He shifted his weight, turning his body fully toward me on the couch. "Claire, this isn't just about how miserable you and Carter are," he said quietly, cutting straight to the core of the issue. "You know that, right? You are smart enough to know that." My breath caught painfully in my throat. I don't know what you are talking about." "You do," he said, his tone low, steady, and devastatingly confident. "You felt it yesterday in the bedroom, you felt it in the kitchen, and I felt it too." There it was, he had dragged the monster out from under the bed and put it squarely in the middle of the room. There was no more playing pretend. There was nowhere left to hide. "No," I panicked, shaking my head rapidly, the denial coming out weak and pathetic. We just had a weird, stressful moment." "It was not just a moment, Claire. It was," I insisted, desperately, violently, lying to both of us. He leaned closer to me. He wasn't touching me yet. He was still inches away, but he was close enough that the radiating heat of his body was wrapping around me. Close enough that the unbearable magnetic tension was pulling impossibly tight between us. "Then look me right in the eye," he challenged, his voice a dark velvet command, "and tell me you don't feel anything happening between us right now." I completely froze, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't look into those dark, intense eyes and lie, and we both knew it. Absolute silence flooded the apartment, infinitely heavier and more dangerous than before. My heart was thrashing so violently against my ribs that I was legitimately terrified he could hear it. This was the final cliff edge. All I had to do was stand up, grab my purse, walk out the front door, and everything could still remain somewhat contained. It would be incredibly messy. Yes, it would be deeply complicated and awkward at Thanksgiving. But it wouldn't be this. It wouldn't be destruction. But I didn't stand up. My muscles refused to obey my brain, and neither did he. And that profound, mutual stillness spoke volumes louder than any words ever could. His hand lifted off his knee. The movement was agonizingly slow, deliberate, as if he were giving me ample time to flinch, to pull away, to scream at him to stop. I didn't move an inch. His warm, calloused fingers brushed lightly against the bare skin of my forearm. The touch was impossibly soft, careful, almost reverent, as if he were testing the structural integrity of something incredibly fragile. I sucked in a sharp, ragged breath, my entire nervous system violently reacting before my rational mind could even begin to process the sensation. "Say something," he murmured, his face inches from mine, his eyes scanning my lips. I should have told him no. Instead, I just looked helplessly into his eyes, completely paralyzed by how much I wanted him. And that silence was all the permission he ever needed. He leaned in closer. The space between us evaporated. And then, I didn't pull away. That is the exact moment I have desperately tried to rewrite in my head 1,000 different ways since that night. In my mind, I have vividly imagined myself suddenly finding my spine, standing up abruptly, taking a massive step backward, and saying something incredibly firm and righteous, something powerful enough to snap the tension cleanly in half. I have constantly replayed the scenario with a fictionalized superior version of myself, a woman who possessed more self-control, more moral clarity, and more unshakable loyalty to her vows. But that is not what happened in reality. What actually happened was that I stayed exactly where I was planted. And when Hayes leaned in and closed the distance, I closed my eyes and let him. The initial contact of his lips against mine wasn't rushed. It wasn't the desperate, aggressive collision of two people making a reckless, explosive mistake. It was agonizingly slow. It was almost hesitant, as if he was offering me one absolute final chance to push him away before the act became permanent and irreversible. I didn't take the chance. His lips brushed mine, soft and questioning, testing the waters to see if I would recoil in horror. I didn't. Instead, driven by an overwhelming wave of pure instinct and starved desperation, I leaned deeply into the kiss. The absolute second I pushed back against him, the entire atmosphere shattered. All of his hesitation completely vanished. Not entirely. There was still a careful reverence to the way he held me, but the kiss instantly deepened. It mutated into something intensely deliberate, something fiercely intentional, something actively and mutually chosen. My heart was pounding with such violent force that it physically ached in my chest. Every single rational, logical thought in my brain was screaming at high volume, desperately ordering me to stop. Think about what you are doing. Think about the nuclear fallout. Think about his brother. Think about your marriage. But none of those screaming alarms were loud enough to break through the overwhelming, blinding sensory overload of what I was feeling in that exact moment. Because for the first time in what felt like a painful eternity, I felt genuinely, desperately wanted. That is the ugly, complicated truth that nobody ever wants to talk about when it comes to infidelity. In that initial, blinding moment, it wasn't strictly about Hayes. It wasn't even entirely about physical attraction, at least not completely. It was about the intoxicating, overwhelming drug of being seen. It was about the intense way he had looked at me. It was about the fact that he paid attention. That he noticed the dark circles under my eyes. That he saw the profound loneliness I was trying so hard to hide. He made me feel like I was a living, breathing, desirable woman, instead of just an invisible fixture in a silent house, and that feeling of sudden visibility. It is incredibly terrifyingly dangerous. Because once you finally get a taste of it after starving in the dark for so long, it becomes almost biologically impossible to pull away. I broke the kiss slightly, pulling back just a fraction of an inch to drag a ragged breath into my lungs, but I refused to create any real physical distance. My hands had somehow found their way up to his chest, resting flat against the warm cotton of his shirt, and I could feel his heartbeat hammering wildly against my palms. It was just as fast and uneven as mine. "This is a massive mistake," I whispered, my voice trembling violently against his jaw. I genuinely meant the words, but my hands tightened their grip on his shirt instead of pushing him away. Hayes didn't retreat. He didn't apologize. He rested his forehead heavily against mine, his breath warm and erratic against my skin. "Then look at me and tell me to stop," he challenged quietly, his voice rough. "Tell me to back off, Claire, and I swear to God I will." I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, tears of overwhelming guilt and desire stinging the corners. I should have told him to stop. I should have screamed it. But instead, I just slowly, helplessly shook my head. And that was the breaking point. That was the exact second the situation crossed over from a highly charged emotional transgression into a physical reality that could never ever be undone. No matter how much therapy or regret followed. He kissed me again, and this time the restraint was completely gone. There was zero hesitation left. It wasn't frantic, but it was incredibly certain, confident, and deeply hungry, in a way that made it blindingly obvious he had been suppressing this urge for much, much longer than just the last 24 hours. My hands moved entirely of their own volition, sliding up from his chest to grip the fabric at his shoulders, desperately anchoring myself to him as if I needed physical proof that this insane moment was actually happening. Because it honestly didn't feel real. It felt like I was hallucinating. It felt like an out-of-body experience happening in a parallel universe, existing in a completely separate, hermetically sealed bubble where real-world consequences couldn't possibly reach us. But they always do. The consequences always break through the glass. I honestly have no idea how long we stayed tangled together on that couch. Time completely blurred, expanding and contracting in a way that made it impossible to measure. It could have been 3 minutes, it could have been an hour. Eventually, the adrenaline began to ebb, and the suffocating weight of reality came crashing back down on my shoulders. I pulled back again, and this time, I forcefully pushed my hands against his chest, breaking the embrace deliberately. "We can't do this," I gasped. My voice shaking so badly I sounded completely unhinged. "Hayes, we can't do this." He didn't immediately argue, he didn't try to pull me back in. He just sat back against the cushions and looked at me, and the expression on his face. It completely broke me. It wasn't the panicked guilt of a man who realized he just ruined his brother's life. It wasn't the cheap regret of a careless mistake. It was something infinitely more complicated, dark, and possessive. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely a rasp, but he didn't physically move away from me. That was the absolute core of the nightmare. We both fully comprehended how catastrophically wrong it was, but neither of us possessed the moral strength in that moment to definitively end it. I stood up abruptly, practically throwing myself off the sectional, frantically creating a massive gulf of physical distance where there hadn't been any a second before. My heart was still racing out of control, my thoughts violently colliding as my brain finally started to process the sheer magnitude of the line I had just crossed. This absolutely cannot happen ever again," I said. My voice rising in panic, trying to force authority into the room. I desperately needed to hear myself establish the boundary. Hayes leaned his head back against the dark fabric of the couch, running both hands exhaustedly over his face and through his hair. He let out a long, heavy exhale. "Okay," but the single word sounded completely hollow. It wasn't convincing coming from his mouth, and I didn't believe it for a second in my own mind. I lunged for my purse, snatching it off the armchair, refusing to make eye contact with him now. The shame was suddenly burning so hot I felt sick to my stomach. "I need to go. I should go right now." "Yeah," he said quietly, his eyes tracking my frantic movements. "You probably should." I practically bolted toward the front door, my heels clicking rapidly against the laminate floor. It felt like I was fleeing a burning building, desperate to get out of that charged atmosphere before the magnetic pull dragged me right back to the couch. My hand was frantically fumbling with the deadbolt when his voice stopped me dead in my tracks. "Claire!" I froze. I kept my back firmly turned to him, my hand hovering over the brass lock. "This isn't just going to magically go away, you know," he said softly, the truth ringing through the small apartment like a death knell. "You can't just put this back in the box." "I know," I whispered, a tear finally breaking loose and hot tracking down my cheek, because that was the undeniable, horrifying reality. "It didn't go away, not after you physically crossed the line, not after you let the monster out of the cage." I threw the deadbolt, pulled the door open, and ran down the concrete stairs without ever looking back. The drive back to my subdivision felt infinitely longer than it actually was. Every single red light felt like an eternity. Every idle second idling at an intersection gave my spiraling mind more time to violently tear myself apart. "What the hell did you just do?" The unanswerable question battered the inside of my skull over and over again. There was absolutely no version of this narrative where I emerged as the victim, or even as a decent human being, no matter how desperately my brain tried to justify it. No matter how much I focused on Carter's neglect and my own profound loneliness. The stark, brutal reality remained entirely unchanged. I had just passionately kissed my husband's younger brother. And infinitely worse, a sick, dark part of my soul desperately wanted to stay in that apartment and do it again. That horrifying realization made my stomach violently churn. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands cramped, praying for the miles to disappear. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house was completely dark. The garage was empty. Carter wasn't back yet. Of course he wasn't. I killed the engine and sat in the dark driveway for 5 minutes, trying to regulate my breathing and wipe the smeared mascara from under my eyes. I felt like a criminal, I stepped out of the car, walked up the front steps, and unlocked the front door, slipping inside as quietly as possible, as if I were a burglar sneaking into my own domestic life. I stood in the entryway, the silence of the house pressing down on my eardrums. Everything looked exactly the same. The expensive sofa, the pristine kitchen island, the framed wedding photos lining the hallway leading to the stairs. It was perfectly normal, completely unchanged. But I was fundamentally ruined. I walked up the hardwood stairs with agonizing slowness, each step feeling heavier and more exhausting than the last. The sheer weight of the guilt was physically crushing me. When I reached the second-floor landing, I walked toward the master bedroom and stopped dead in the doorway. This was the exact spot where the nightmare had started, where Hayes had walked in 24 hours ago, where the tectonic plates had begun to violently shift. I stepped inside the dark room, my chest painfully tight. My mind still racing a million miles a minute, trying to figure out how I was going to look Carter in the eye tomorrow morning without completely breaking down. And that is exactly when I saw it. There was a faint, artificial glow illuminating the center of our unmade bed. Something was sitting on the mattress that absolutely had not been there when I fled the house hours ago. My stomach instantly dropped into an icy abyss. I took a slow, hesitant step closer. My heart, which had just started to calm down, began to hammer against my ribs again. But this time, it was fueled by a completely different, chilling kind of adrenaline. It was Carter's personal cell phone. He must have stopped by the house to grab something while I was at Hayes's apartment and absent-mindedly left it behind in his rush to get back out the door. But it wasn't just sitting there, it was completely unlocked. And the screen was glaring brightly in the dark room, displaying a brand new unread text message. I stood frozen beside the nightstand, staring down at the glowing rectangle. My breath completely hitched in my throat as the banner notification expanded across the glass. The sender's name was Jessica. I didn't know a Jessica, not from his firm. Not from our friend group. My eyes dragged themselves down to read the preview text of the message. The words hit me like a physical bullet to the chest, turning the blood in my veins to absolute ice. Last night was absolutely amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. I stared at the glowing letters until they burned into my retinas. The silence in the bedroom was so absolute it was deafening. I felt like the hardwood floor had just violently dropped out from under my feet, leaving me in a terrifying suspended freefall. Because in that horrifying, paralyzing moment, every single confusing, painful thing about the last 2 years suddenly snapped into crystal clear focus. The late nights at the firm, the aggressive emotional distance, the absolute lack of intimacy, the dead, empty look in his eyes when I tried to talk to him. It hadn't been a lack of interest in life. It had been a lack of interest in me. I had spent the entire evening torturing myself, consumed by a suffocating, soul-crushing guilt for desperately seeking a moment of comfort in the arms of his brother. I had hated myself, and the entire time, my husband had been sleeping with someone else.